Educators Lead, episode 123.
You got to control what you can control. So that's really about looking at situations and finding, okay, what can I control in this situation and doing the best I can with that.
Welcome to Educators Lead, where we interview leaders in education to offer inspiration and practical advice to help launch educators into the next level of leadership. I'm your host, Jay Willis, and I want to thank you for subscribing to our show.
This is John Lee Dumas of EO Fire, and you're listening to Educators Lead. Let's join my friend Jay Willis and get ready to take your leadership to the next level.
Hello, EduLeaders. Jay Willis here, and I'm excited to introduce our featured guest today, Ben Bruni. Ben, are you ready?
Absolutely, man. I am fired up to be here.
Awesome. Ben Bruni is an assistant principal at Adairville Elementary and Middle School, a rural preschool through 8th grade school located in Logan County, Kentucky. This is his 14th year in public education and his second as an assistant principal. Prior to becoming an assistant principal, he spent his first decade of his career as a high school English teacher and head football coach. He also spent 2 deeply impactful years working as a program director in an urban alternative school. Ben is an avid reader and study of leadership and organizational psychology, and he has spoken at conferences and professional developments on a variety of topics such as leadership in athletics, empowering your players, making the transition to administration, a practical guide of what to expect in your first year, and 3 behavioral psychology studies that benefit educational leadership. He also wanted me to mention he's also a huge fan of this podcast, Educators Lead.
Absolutely, man. Yeah, this is great stuff you've got going here.
Awesome. Well, and that's just a brief introduction, Ben, but I guess tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Well, I obviously have been in education for a while. I am married to a special education high school teacher. We have 3 wonderful daughters. The oldest is in the last quarter of her senior year, so she's getting ready to make that big old jump to college next year, and we'll see how we handle that. And our middle is she's sophomore, and she's a softball player. And then our youngest, I actually just got done touring her new junior high school with her, and she's going into junior high next year. So 3 girls keep us busy, and a wife who's a runner who's running all the time. And, you know, it's a pretty busy life, but it's a good one. Wow. Yeah, that's got to keep you busy. I have 2 girls, a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old, and then an older son who's 10. But, man, those girls they're something. Daddy's little girls for sure. They are. They're wonderful. They love you, you know. I mean, you know, I always say, you know, boys love their mamas, but girls, they love their daddy. Yeah. Yeah, well, so what would be maybe something interesting about yourself that most people wouldn't know? You know, I always like to throw out, you know, this fact on people before they see me, and they know I'm an education guy, and I've got a football background as well, so they know I'm kind of into athletics and stuff. But something I always throw on people, and they're like, no way, is that at one point I was trying to become a bull rider. People are like, what? You did what? And I was like, yeah, I got really into bull riding, got really into rodeo. And so I gave it a go. You know, I'm a bigger guy, so I wasn't particularly successful at it, but I did try it. Yeah. Well, so you have to remember the very first time you ever got on a bull. What was that experience like? You walk by them. You know, if you're standing on the ground and you walk by a bull, you're about as tall or taller than the bull. You know, I'm a 6'2" guy, so I'm a pretty big person. So you don't really think that much of it. And then when you get down on top of it, you don't really look at the bull. You don't really look at the bull's head or the horns. What you look down and see is you see this dinner plate sized hoof. And you're looking at that thing and you're like, you know, if I'm on the ground and this thing steps on me, I'm done. I mean, because it's huge. you just don't realize it until you're right there. And that was like kind of the aha moment, like, oh my goodness, what am I doing? But definitely a life-changing experience, something you can always talk about. It's a fun fact. And anytime in a PD, when they make you stand up, say, hey, tell us your name and something interesting about yourself. I just pull my trump card out and just lay it down on the table. Yeah,
I was a bull rider. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. I am just fascinated by your story. So how do you what's it like being an English teacher and a football coach? That seems like an interesting combination.
Yeah. The thing that generally draws as much surprise as saying, hey, I tried bull riding was, hey, I was a football coach and an English teacher. A lot of people, they don't put those two things together. But those are two things I love. And there is a lot of crossover from the things I was doing in my classroom to the things I was doing out on the football field with my players. And it's just, we all have those things that we're passionate about, and mine just subject-wise happen to be English. And so, when I put the two and two together, it made me really hireable as a head coach because, a lot of times schools are looking around, they're going, okay, we got to create a PE position or a driver's ed position. When I come in there and I say, hey, I'm interested in being your football coach. By the way, I also teach English. Oh, this guy's hireable.
Yeah. So from bull riding to English teacher, head or football coach to now assistant principal. So I want to dig in and talk about your path because it sounds very fascinating. For people who may not be familiar with your story, if you don't mind, maybe start from the beginning, maybe even when you first kind of got that inspiration that you wanted to go into education, and talk about how you got from there to where you are today. Yeah,
sure. Well, I was always around education because both of my parents were psychology professors. And so I grew up around academic conversations. And they were always, with friends and they were debating academic topics. And so you just kind of naturally gravitate towards those things that you see and hear from your parents a lot of times. And that was for me, education and school. So, I was a fairly decent student. I wasn't the top of the class, but, I went through school and I knew I liked reading. I knew I liked writing. And I got into college, and when I figured out that I was not going to be a professional football player, I kind of stepped away from the game. And it just so happened that my old high school had an opening for needing a coach. And my old coach gave me a call and he said, hey, man, I know you're taking classes. I know you're still in school, but would you be interested in coaching? I said, yeah, sure. So I went out there and I immediately found out I was a much better coach than I ever was a player. I just kind of came naturally to me to do that and to instruct and to come up with new ways of teaching kids how to do these things. And so I went through my last couple of years of college coaching for a local high school. And at the end of it, my coach came up to me and he says, so, I know you're an English guy. What are you going to do after school, after college? I gave the atypical, semi-wandering college student answer. Well, I think I'll go to law school. And, he kind of looked at me funny. He said, I know you've done a couple of teacher ed classes. What's your feeling there? And I said, Coach, I've looked at that pay schedule and I'm just not real sure about it. And he said, well, just do your student teaching, put it in your back pocket, and we'll see what happens. So I said, that's logical. And my old coach, he was a see down the road guy. He knew what was going to happen. He just had to let me find my own way to getting there. So I did my student teaching. I loved it. I actually ended up student teaching at a rival high school. Sports wise, which I thought was going to be strange. And that was when I learned that there's a real difference between what's going on inside the building and what's going on Friday nights, And so here was this school that I had always been taught to really dislike. And I just fell in love with it, because the kids were great and the faculty was great. And I learned that my school that I had all my experiences with wasn't the only really great school full of really great people out there. It was it was an aha moment. So I did my student teaching. I loved it. But again, I just kept coming back to it. I was like, wow, I'm not going to make a whole lot of money doing that. And, my dad kind of pulled me aside. He goes, you're going to be happy whether you have a lot of money or whether you have very little money. Your happiness is going to be drawn from doing what you love doing every day, not what the check says at the end of it. So I was like, okay, I'm going to put this one in fate's hands a little bit. And so I was 23 years old. I was way too young to get a head coaching job, but I had been at a really nice high school that had a lot of success. So there was some weight carried with having been an assistant there. I said, all right, I'm going to throw my name out there. And I'm going to apply for head coaching jobs, and I'm going to let the good Lord guide me. And if he wants me to be in education, he's going to let me become a head coach. I mean, he's going to let that happen, even though it shouldn't happen. No, 23-year-olds shouldn't get hired as head coaches. There's too much going on. Well, I got hired as a head coach. So I kind of looked upward and said, okay, I hear you, big guy. I'm going to do what you say here. So I got my first head coaching gig, and I also, started out teaching English at the high school level at a little rural high school, and it was just a wonderful experience that taught me so much. And within a week of having my own room and doing my own thing and teaching, I was hooked. I was like, all right, okay, I have no desire to go to law school. This is where I belong. And I came back. I came back to my hometown, to a much bigger high school, and was the head coach there for about a decade and taught English. And towards the end of that decade, I had done a lot of the things I wanted to do as a head football coach. I just got lucky and had a lot of success early on. I had some really great players, but even more importantly, I had really supportive administrators. And I had great assistant coaches. So I had guys that were just phenomenal at taking my vision and make it even better. And then I had administrators that were phenomenal in dealing with my personalities and my growing pains and helping me and helping our program grow. So we had a lot of success. And my last year, we went 13-1, went to the Final Four.
Wow.
In the state. Yeah. And it was a great experience. But I was ready to do something else. I had been doing it for a while. And, one of the problems with getting into being a head coach at a very young age is that, where most people are in their careers later on, I had kind of hit that point pretty early. So I'm looking down the stretch. I got 20 more years to go as a teacher and an educator. And so, I said, well, I want to do something different. And a job opened up in my old district to work at the alternative school, running their alternative to suspension program. And I said, you know what, let's break the mold. Let's go do this. And it also afforded me an opportunity to go back and kind of be a part-time assistant at my old high school, which was really pleasurable because my old coach was still the coach there. So after all these years of being a head coach and doing this thing, I was able to go back to where it really started for me. Yeah, it was a full circle moment. And I got to coach, and we won a state championship, and it was wonderful.
Wow.
And I got this incredible opportunity to work in an alternative school for 2 years, a very urban alternative school. And it was an eye-opening experience. It changed the way I look at, dealing with behaviors and dealing with, emotional and social disorders that some students may come into a building with, and diffusing situations. And it really changed me. And at the end of it, I had done that for 2 years. And someone said to me, well, why don't you look at building level administration? I said, well, that's another mold to break. Let's give it a try. So I get online and I'm looking around. I'm like, where are some jobs? And I see this assistant principal job at a K-8 school. Actually, it's preschool through 8. So it's 10 grades, a lot of curriculum. And it's in this place called Adairville, Kentucky, and I have absolutely no idea where Adairville, Kentucky is. So I have to Google map it. I find it, well, it's 50 minutes away. Okay, that's reasonable. So I throw my name in the hat. I get an interview, I get a second interview, and then I get offered the job. And, you know, I had never worked in an elementary school. My only experience really with that level of kid was my own children. But it was like when I first walked in to do my student teaching. I mean, it took me about 15 minutes to go, wow, this is awesome. This is the best place in the world to be. I mean, you cannot have a bad day around kindergartners. It is literally impossible.
Yeah.
If you're having a bad day, I tell people just walk down to the primary end of our building and you can no longer be having a bad day because people will hug you until you smile.
Yeah.
And it was just a wonderful place for me to land. And I got paired up with a principal, and she came in with me. They hired the principal and the assistant principal simultaneously, and the principal came in with me. They could not have paired me. I mean, again, I looked kind of skyward and I said, okay, big guy, you got me again. You put me with the perfect person, because, you know, I came in with a lot of rough edges. You know, I had worked in an alternative school. I'd been a head football coach. You know, I'd just been at a high school. And so I get paired up with this person who just sands all those rough edges off of me. And we work really well as a team. You know, she's a big data person. I'm a big culture person. So, you know, just it was really a great match for me to fall into. And so, you know, and that's where I am right now.
Yeah. So this is your second year there?
Yes.
In that position?
Yeah. Second year.
So I'm sure there are a lot of people who are listening to this who maybe are in a classroom right now and are maybe halfway thinking about going into school leadership. So, I mean, what was it? Because I'm sure you have examples from your past of times when you maybe thought about doing something and you didn't, and you allowed fear or self-doubt or whatever it was to keep you from attempting something that you thought might be a good idea to try. So what was it about this experience? Like, what was it about school leadership? What made you feel as though you were ready to try this challenge?
Well, you know, I always study leadership. You know, I read a lot of books on it. And even when I was a football coach, I was reading lots and lots of stuff on leadership. And I was always kind of taking notes. And if, you know, for people that stay in schools, most schools don't have the benefit of having administrators that stay there for long periods of time. It's just kind of a pretty high turnover job. And so you get these blocks of 4 and 5 years with an administrator, and then somebody new comes in. And each time that happens, things change and new initiatives come to, you know, light, and, you know, people want to do things their own way. So as I went through that, I went through several administrators. And I really took notes. I took notes kind of mentally on, hey, that was great, or, oh, wow, you know, I didn't really feel valued right there. And so as I was mentally taking notes, I was taking those notes, and then almost if you created two columns, I was looking at all those leadership things I'm doing here in football. And then I'm looking at all these notes I'm kind of taking on the leadership that I'm seeing in the building and at the district level. And man, there's a lot of crossover. You know, those two things, you know, any sports, you know, is a great place to start, because there's just so much crossover between what you're doing with your team and then what you see happening at building and district levels. And even in the business world, that model still works. You look at kind of what happens in sports and you see people, you know, using that in business. I mean, how many business leaders do we always hear talk about, well, John Wooden did this and we use that in our business to do this. It's just got a lot of crossover. So I think the thought was in my mind for a long time. And, you know, I do think there's that seed of self-doubt. You know, even now as an assistant principal and, you know, as I set my eyes maybe a little down the road as being a principal or a district level administrator, you know, there's that seed of doubt that you ask yourself, you know, will I be successful at this? And I think that we all have to kind of face that fear. And, sometimes that fear is a good thing for us because it makes us cautious and reminds us to kind of watch where we're going and think about things maybe a little more deeply. So, I try to take that fear and harness it and make it a good thing. So that's kind of where I went with that.
Yeah. Well, so what have been some of the biggest struggles? I mean, this is, you're into your second year now. So what have been, maybe what were some of the struggles along the journey to becoming a school administrator? And then what have been some of the biggest struggles, like once you were actually in that position?
Well, what's funny is I listen to this podcast a lot, and this is one of the wonderful tools I used in preparing myself for that. I can't be more thankful for this podcast that you have, because it is just person after person after person telling stories of this very journey. And if you listen to a lot of your podcasts, I sense that there are certain themes that come to light. And one of those themes is that I've heard several people say to you is, I applied for job after job after job, and I just didn't get any. And I was at the point where I was like, wow, I'm going to give up. It's just not meant to be. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, they fall into the right place, almost as though, they were being sheltered away from places that maybe they shouldn't have gone to. And somebody with a bigger picture in mind put them in the right spot. And I think about that a lot when I'm considering looking at places and looking at jobs. And I think how odd it is that there was a town and a school that I had never heard of that was just 50 minutes away from me. It's not like it's, in another state or something, that I had never heard of this place, but yet somehow I found my way there. And I'm one of these guys that believes there's greater things at motion. Mm-hmm. And I think that, one of the struggles that has always been prevalent with, I have several friends who are administrators, is, you're out there and you're looking for jobs, and, there just aren't a whole lot of jobs out there. And you get this idea in your mind of what's the ideal fit. Oh, I'm going to be at this school, and, I'm going to be right here in my own neighborhood, and that's what's going to be the perfect fit for me. And oftentimes that's not the case. Oftentimes the perfect fit for you is outside of your comfort zone. And so I think one of the great challenges as I've gone into this and as I've grown through this is getting out of that comfort zone. I had to get out of being a football coach. I had to get away from everybody calling me Coach Bruni. That's different. Even some of my friends still now joke. They're like, so I guess we call you Mr. Bruni now. And just that connotation is different for a lot of people. So I had to get away from that comfort zone. I had to get away from the comfort zone of high school. High school and how you interact with kids is so different from an elementary school, from the use of sarcasm and humor all the way down to the facial expressions and general demeanor in which you walk down a hall. All of those things have to change. So, there were a lot of comfort zones that I've had to break out of. And even now, I'm still doing that. I'm learning how to have tough conversations with other professionals right now, because, when you first come in, you don't want to ruffle any feathers. You don't really want to make anybody feel uncomfortable, including yourself. But you're not helping anybody grow when you do that either.
Right.
So I'm having to break out of that comfort zone, and I'm getting some really good stuff through, trainings that our district is doing and things that I'm looking up on my own of how to have good, constructive conversations that maybe aren't just all complimentary. So, those have been challenges for me.
Right. Well, so you've been in this position now going on your second year, and I'm sure you have some awesome stories of the impact that you've been able to witness and to be a part of. But what's been maybe one of your best moments there as a school administrator?
Well, I do talks with our kids. And again, we're preschool through 8th grade. So we have primary, intermediate, and middle school kids. And one thing that we like to do as an administration is we like to just maybe once a month take some time and talk to each of those groups individually, and not really talk about school, but talk about life and how to do better, how to be a better person, how to empathize, how to deal with tough situations in life. So we have these talks with our groups about once a month. And one talk that I did with our intermediate groups, our 4 or 5 grade kids, that was super successful, was I gave a speech that I call the My Bad speech. And that's where I talked to the kids. And what I really focus on telling them is that, one of the toughest things for kids to learn, and even adults to learn, is that, 1, we all mess up. And 2, when we do mess up, one of the best tools that we have in our toolbox for dealing with that is to just say, my bad. And I told them, I go home and sometimes I forget to feed the dog. And it's really easy for me to come up with a whole list of excuses. Oh, well, I was tired from work. I had to get to the gym. And I've got all these excuses to give. And really, all my wife needed to hear me say was, my bad. I apologize. I'll make sure that doesn't happen again. And I gave that speech to these kids. And I cannot tell you the number of times where I've had kids come into the office and we're dealing with an issue. Like maybe they said a word they shouldn't have said, or maybe they, copied off someone on a test. And I say, all right, here's what I've got you doing. What's your take on it? And man, that moment when they look at me and they go, Mr. Bruni, my bad. I admit it. I did it. I'm sorry. And I'm like, oh, that's so useful. That's so useful because you've totally acknowledged that you understand what you did was wrong. You're remorseful and you understand that you just had a moment of weakness, that you were a human there for just a second. You didn't give me excuses. You didn't try to dance around it. You just got down to the nitty gritty of it, which is you made a human mistake. You're probably not going to make it again. My bad. And so that was a super successful thing for me.
Yeah. Own it. Boy, that's a big deal.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah. Well, so I guess one of the things that I'm curious about from your introduction, and I know you said both your parents are psychologists, right?
Yes.
So, and I'm sure that had inspired your interest in, the leadership and organizational psychology and maybe the connection between the two. So I'm really curious about, just the, I think it was something that you'd spoken on at a conference, the 3 behavioral psychology studies that benefit educational leadership. Could you give us a little bit, maybe a sneak peek into that, maybe some, like a cheat sheet bullet point version of what that was all about?
Yeah, sure. So, I grew up listening to my 2 parents continually talk about how so much of what we do is either based on, human behavior or genetics. So much of what happens is based on those 2 things. And then when you begin to consider environment and its impact on people's behavior, it was like, wow, so many questions can be answered by examining a few things. So, for instance, one of the things I like to talk about is broken windows theory. And that's the theory that developed, Malcolm Gladwell brought it to light in, I believe, Tipping Point. And he talks about how when New York City experienced a sudden drop in crime, what happened is that a couple of, I believe, organizational psychologists took a look at what was happening in New York, and they said, okay, what are some small changes that we can do that can have massive impact? And they started covering up all the graffiti on the subways in New York. And anytime somebody put graffiti up on the subway, they covered it up. And they just wouldn't let it happen. They wouldn't let it happen on the cars. They wouldn't let it happen in the tunnels of the subway. And the crime rates in the subway immediately dropped. And the explanation for that was that by allowing the graffiti to exist, or imagine in a neighborhood, allowing a broken window to exist unfixed, what that says is to people that may have inclinations towards deviant behavior, that deviant behavior in this area will be permitted. In other words, we will not solve the problem of you putting up spray paint on the walls or throwing a rock through the window. And it causes those people to, A, allow that deviant behavior to become more prevalent, and B, it causes those people of deviant behavior to gravitate towards that area. So what happens is that you get both a rise in people's behaviors that may not need to rise, and you get a collection of those types of people in an area, all essentially based on just ignoring a problem. So in educational leadership, this comes down to, okay, how do we prevent this? Well, you find small things. Like, for instance, if you're in a junior high school and locker doors are the locker doors on your lockers are just left kind of hanging open. If that's allowed to persist, then there's kind of a sloppiness being accepted in your building. And that translates to big things happening. So, okay, well, I don't really have to take care of my locker. Well, what says I have to take care of the cafeteria or the hallways or anything in this building? I can just I don't really have to worry about trash. So it's really the idea that you can look at small, persistent problems, that you can deal with those small, persistent problems, and that by doing that, it will have large-scale effects. So that's just kind of a snippet of something I focus on.
Yeah. Do you have a story of application for that? Is it, like as far as how you've seen that, been used, or you've used it yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So in our school, we have we had the blow hand dryers, and kids come out and they blow hand dry. Well, what we discovered is on the primary end of our building, that takes forever. Because little kids, they got to go to the bathroom a lot, so they go to the bathroom they're continually. Well, what was happening is that they'd go to the bathroom, that wouldn't take very long. They'd wash their hands, that wouldn't take very long, and then we'd just get a log jam at the blow dryer. So what's the obvious answer? So we installed the paper towel dispensers. Well, what happens is that the paper towel dispensers, they get the paper towels, they wad them up, and then they put them down in the trash can. But sometimes they'd kind of miss. They'd kind of get in the trash can. They wouldn't get in the trash can. And what ended up happening is you end up with paper towels all over the floor. As soon as I saw that, I said to myself, okay, if I allow paper towels for this to happen, what will happen is that students will then feel that it's okay to leave paper on the floor, because here is one instance of paper being left on the floor. Why is it not okay for me to leave paper on the floor in the classroom? And so it was kind of an identifier. And so I immediately started just, anytime I was around the bathrooms, and, one thing you learn as an assistant principal is you better hang around the bathrooms. You just kind of got to hang around those places, because those are the places where a lot of your issues come from. And I would just, anytime a paper towel wouldn't go in and I saw it, I'd, say, hey, can you get that back in there for me? And it didn't take very long of doing that, or of having students see me pick up a couple and put in a trash can, for that problem to totally disappear. But they needed to see that I was going to enforce it, and they needed to see that there was a certain ownership about it, that, hey, we've got paper towels down here. We're not having to wait. But with that comes a little bit of responsibility. So, yeah, that cleaned itself up really quick. And it was just a matter of thinking about, what effect will this have?
Yeah, that's fascinating. I wouldn't have expected the crime rates to be affected just by getting rid of the graffiti, but it actually,
Yeah.
I mean, it makes sense, but you wouldn't have thought it had that kind of effect.
Exactly. And that's really where I try to touch when I talk about these behavioral studies, because, you look at something like that and you say, well, how do we fix the crime rate? Well, we've got to arrest more people. But that's fighting fire with fire, and nobody wins there. Everybody gets burned to the ground when you try to fight fire with fire. It's just been proven over and over and over again it does not work. So when you find something that triggers a behavioral action, something as simple as, graffiti on the wall says this is a place that's not taken care of and is a place where, you're not really going to be watched that close. So all of a sudden you get all the wrong people in there. Something as simple as that is deep and meaningful impact.
So I am curious, just in your interesting journey that you have had that's brought you to where you're at, what's the application? What are maybe some things that you learned as a head coach that you have applied to being now a school administrator?
Pretty much every lesson that you learn as a head coach really is applicable to a lot of the things that you do in administration. One of the ones there towards the end of my head coaching time, we really adopted a saying where we would say to our kids, control what you can control. And by that, we were really talking about, when penalty flags get thrown, we're going to get the penalty. If we spend a lot of time complaining about it, yelling at officials, like I did when I was a younger coach, I spent a lot of time, wasting my energies yelling at officials in a manner that A, did not get the call reversed, and B, just made the officials kind of, not like me. There towards the end, we started really saying control what you can control. So sometimes you're going to get a penalty thrown on you, okay? Sometimes your fire alarm's going to go off and there's no way to shut it off. So you got to control what you can control. So that's really about looking at situations and finding, okay, what can I control in this situation, and doing the best I can with that. So that's a big thing. Another thing that we really stressed in our program and football that carried over into administration is a lot of communication about organization, in terms of when are we going to do what, and then sticking to that, because people are busy. In football, it's a matter of parents are busy, and 2/3 of your team is probably getting picked up and dropped off by parents. In schools, you have parents, you have teachers that have a lot of other things going on outside the walls of the building. And the clearer and more organized you are, the better you can be at really helping those people to understand, okay, I need to set aside this time. I need to block that out. I need to be able to use this other time to do all my other stuff. And that's important because that really helps people. And it also helps you, because then, when you've got to have your stuff ready to go. Yeah.
Well, so I'm going to roll through some rapid fire questions if you're ready for those.
Absolutely.
So first off, what would you say is the best leadership advice you've ever received?
Go slow, low and slow, like it's in a crock pot. That's probably some of the best stuff I've ever heard. And I may have heard it on your podcast. If you think about it, like you're cooking, once you overcook something, you go fast, there's no getting it back. It's overcooked. But, if you go low and slow and you find out, well, this is a little undercooked, you can always cook it a little longer. So unless you have to, take your time with decisions. I always liken it to driving in a parking lot. In like a Kroger parking lot or a Walmart parking lot, you don't want to drive fast in those places. There's so many things coming at you from so many different angles. You want to take your time and get out of there without any dings on the car. So, that's probably the best I've ever heard.
Right. I have heard that so many times from different guests at all different levels, but especially the more experienced. Do you think that, because I know that myself in my early 20s, I probably wasn't going to be super receptive if somebody had come to me and said, look, go slow. Just, when you get somewhere, keep your mouth shut and just listen and learn. How do you think somebody could convey that message to someone that's in their early 20s to where they'd actually receive it?
Well, I think that people do best when you first let them know that you totally understand where they are, and this is me talking to 23-year-old head coach me. I really thought I was Vince Lombardi. I thought I was, the good Lord's gift of football. And, I had to be served some real humble pie to learn that, wow, a lot of these things that my older mentors are saying to me that I kind of brushed off as archaic or, didn't apply to me, that they were real truths. And I think sometimes I brushed those off because I felt like I was being talked down to. Like somebody was saying, I know this to be true. You need to follow it. And I think a big thing that you can do in terms of that is when I talk to younger coaches, because I still have a lot of friends who are coaches, and I talk to guys who are maybe looking to go into head coaching or something like that. One of the things I really try to do is get where they are mind-wise and say, hey, I totally get this, man. You've got a great idea here. Let me bounce a couple things off you that have to do with this idea and just tell me what you're thinking when I throw that suggestion out there. And that to me has so much more success because you're not discounting their idea, because there are a lot, there are 23-year-old head football coaches or 24-year-old or 25 coaches, teachers out there. They've got really great ideas that, those folks who have done it for a while haven't had that idea. So sometimes they do have something really good. But when they have something that's not so good, and what the result is going to be, instead of just telling them this isn't going to work, just kind of lead them down the path and help them to kind of rationalize and figure it out for themselves, because we're really going to trust what we figure out on our own. We're not going to be so trusting of what we're just told.
That's brilliant, actually, because it's you're basically giving a more experienced person's advice back to him, right? You're saying be patient with those people who are impatient in helping them understand, baby. Right? And so it's funny though because once you have the experience, you're like you get quickly impatient with those people who don't have the experience and who have that kind of ego and are thinking they are God's gift to football or Vince Lombardi, like you were talking about. And, for those experienced people, I feel like you just hit it right on the head, which is the best advice for those people to give if they really do want to be impactful to the younger people who maybe don't have the experience, is be patient in the way that you approach that and do it from a relationship standpoint instead of just trying to, share your infinite wisdom with them and being impatient with the fact that they're not getting it quickly.
Yeah, that's beautiful, man. I mean, you said it right on. I mean, it's amazing how many times, if we're really introspective and we really think about things that we do, how many times we'll give advice to people and we'll talk about, hey, here's how you ought to do something. And then we'll turn around and totally not follow our own advice. I mean, it happens to me all the time. I mean, now as an administrator, there will be times I will be walking down the hall and I'll be like, I just totally went against what I've said to people. I dropped the ball on that one. And you'll have to go back and do some humbling, do some apologizing. And, and sometimes you just got to go back and you got to say, my bad.
Yeah. Wow. Patience at any level of experience, any age. I feel like that's such a valuable thing for people to have.
Absolutely.
Well, so what would you say is your biggest strength as a school administrator?
I think I used to say to people that it was building a team, building that team mentality, building that attitude of we're all in this together. We're all pulling on the same oar. We're getting the things going in the right direction. But now the more I think about it and the longer I try to do it and the more I try to hold on to this, I really want it to be is that I remember what it's like to be a classroom teacher. And I really try to remember what it's like to be a kid in the classroom. And I think that is, if I hold on to it, if I won't get lost in being an administrator or being an adult, that I'll remember what it was like to have 33 kids and have that one kid who just will not adhere to the classroom rules, or to be in that classroom where I've got super high level learners on one side of the room and super low level learners on the other side of the room. And I've got an administrator saying to me, hey, teach them all the same. To never lose sight of what those struggles were as a classroom teacher, or to never lose sight of what it's like to be the kid in the junior high school that maybe is getting picked on, that's not telling anybody about it, but it's really affecting their life. To not lose those things is probably the most important, maybe not my greatest asset, but it's the most important thing to me.
So do you have a book or two that you'd recommend for other school leaders that have made a big impact on you?
Yeah, I've got a couple. I always go with They Call Me Coach by John Wooden. I think that, tycoons of industry, great school leaders, great coaches, if you're in a leadership role and you're not reading John Wooden's, They Call Me Coach, you're missing out, because, boy, he gets down. When you read about him teaching UCLA how to put their socks on, there's an instance in that book where he's talking about how you put your socks on. It's mind-blowing in terms of the effect it has on leadership. And again, we go back to, one of those behavioral things, small things, big changes. A second one that I try to tell people, and this is more in a conversation than trying to, put a book off on somebody. I say, every once in a while, go back and read Calvin and Hobbes. People look at me like I'm crazy. Like, what are you talking about? Read Calvin and Hobbes. I'm like, yeah, go read Calvin and Hobbes. Well, why? I said, well, Bill Watterson, who was the author of that comic strip, gives absolutely brilliant insight onto the way kids think and the way that they see the world. And then he parallels it in that comic strip with how adults are seeing those exact same situations. And it reminds us as adults that kids don't think like we do, and that they think differently, and that they see the world differently. And then sometimes a heap of laundry is actually a mountain that's being climbed. And it's just a wonderful reminder to us in education, where our job is to connect with kids. We're not just here to teach them. We got to connect with them, and to get down and see the way they're seeing the world, see what they're thinking when they're sitting in that desk in our classroom. It's a valuable tool, and it's pretty funny too. So it's just a minute to kind of step away. So that's a second one I always recommend, and one that gets me some funny looks, but I think the rationale behind it's solid.
Yeah, I was a big Calvin and Hobbes fan back when I was a kid, especially like junior high school. So it was hilarious stuff.
Yeah, because it reminds you of how you thought when you were 6, 7, 8 years old.
Yeah.
And those are good times in our lives. And so, if we remember that, and we just don't see our students just as adults or people that we need to, only teach them to see it our way. If we remember to see things their way, we get so much further with them.
So what advice would you have for a school leader in regard to working with their students?
Just kind of going back to what I was just talking about, find their level and get down on their level, and get to know your kids. When it comes to being a building administrator, we can get really caught up with things like, improving instruction for our teachers, making sure all our paperwork's done, making sure that we're returning parent phone calls, that we're getting positive stuff out, that we're handling the negative stuff in a right way. And then in all that I just said, it's never, just sitting down and connecting with Johnny and Susie. And I think that one of the great things that you can do as a building level administrator is to connect with your kids. And the way to do it is to tell them stories about when you were a kid. One of the great movements right now in leadership is the power of storytelling. And we all have stories from when we were kids. And one of the most impactful things I do with our junior high or middle school kids is I tell them about the struggles I had as a middle school kid, because I did have struggles. And I kind of tell them about, I was there. I know what it's like to maybe not have the best skin complexion, or I know what it's like to be in the hallway alone with the really, really big kid who somehow matured and looks like a 19-year-old, but he's 14, and he's maybe not the nicest kid. And I know that feeling of anxiety. I understand it. And to get down on their level and to talk to them about it, and to be really excited when a kindergartner shows you that they've colored in the lines this time, and not to just feign excitement, to be excited, because that's growth and that's a good thing happening. And they're really fired up about it. And you're going to have an impact on them by getting fired up with them. So, I really say, reach back and touch those times in your lives and communicate with kids that where they are. Because again, going back to that low and slow talk, when I get to people and they understand that, hey, this guy talking to me knows where I'm coming from, they open up so much more.
That reminds me, just you talking about coloring inside the lines. Our 5-year-old is in kindergarten this year, and throughout the year, she has learned to read. And it's just, it's amazing. I mean, you watch the metamorphosis between the beginning of the school year where she couldn't read to where now, she's picking up books. And, if we leave a note, you have to be careful what we leave out now. Not that there's anything bad, but just like we can't, my wife and I can't leave notes like, hey, we have a present for, our daughter hidden somewhere or something. She can read it. So we can't do that anymore. So yeah, it's just fascinating.
It is. And isn't it awesome to watch it happen? I mean, it's just, there's, I think back and people always say, tell me a good memory. And I say, sitting when my daughter was about 3 years old, being on the beach and, with her during that time, if I can go back to a time, that's where I go back if I need a good memory. They're in that developmental stage. And like I said, you walk down to the kindergartners, the first graders, the second graders, even the third graders, you can't have a bad day. I mean, sometimes I feel kind of bad for the teachers because they look worn out, but those kids, they are where life should be. They're so open and so excited to be learning new things. And in addition to that, their hearts are good. And I think that the more we can connect older kids with that kind of way of thinking, the better off we are. And the only way to do that is to remind them that, yeah, that's where you came from. We can always go back to where we came from. And so, that's beautiful, man. That's awesome that she's reading.
Yeah. Well, so, in addition to advice that you'd have for this school leader as far as working with the students, what kind of along those lines, what piece of advice would you have for a school leader as far as working with the teachers?
For me, I spent the first year just kind of getting used to talking to teachers in a way that I wasn't just another teacher. I was an administrator. And no matter how hard you try, that is going to be a real, kind of a barrier at times and a bridge at times. In terms of the conversations you have, people are going to be a little more reserved at times. People are going to come to you with requests that they wouldn't ask you if you were just a teacher with them. So, it kind of changes the dynamic. But what I really realized is that while I was really supporting people, I was not giving them growth feedback, and I didn't know how to do it. So I had the benefit of our district being a wonderful district. I've got to give some love and a shout out to my district, Logan County Schools. I mean, awesome progressive district. So our superintendent brought in Mike Rutherford, and he's all about feedback on instruction and coaching instruction. How do we make instruction better? And so he gave us some great tools about how to walk into a classroom, look around, find a cause, see the effect it's having, communicate that in like 30 seconds. When that teacher takes a breath, walk up and say, hey, I really like the way you gave emphasis with your hand to emphasize that word. That made me feel it. And I saw kids kind of doing it with their hands too. And that really helped understand that context. And it took 30 seconds to do that. And what you've done is you've reinforced a strength that teacher has. And I'm all about strength-based leadership. Find what people are good at and enhance that. So, for me, if I were saying to, another new administrator and, I give a talk, what to expect in your first year, one thing I'll add this year to that talk is saying, really go out and spend some deliberate time figuring out, how do I provide instructional coaching that is very beneficial and does not create resistance? In other words, I don't want to provide instructional coaching that makes teachers feel judged. I want them to feel like, what's Mr. Bruni going to see that's positive in my room today? That's what I want to see, and that's how I want to feel when my superintendent comes and walks around with me. I want to feel like, what's Mr. Mullins going to see that I'm doing well, as because we all have somebody that's evaluating us, and be able to provide meaningful and non-judgmental coaching it's a really tough skill. But one that's really well worth your time in terms of investing to learn about.
Yeah. What was the phrase you used? Strength-based. What was it?
It's strength-based leadership.
Yeah.
It's actually a book that was produced by Gallup. And what they did is that they identify that we all have certain leadership traits and qualities. And that the idea behind it is that data shows us that when we attack people's weak points, in other words, everybody's got things that maybe they're not that great at, that the movement that we're going to get with them is not going to be overwhelming. In other words, we can take somebody that's bad at something and move them to marginal, but we're never going to move them to good to great, because that's not really what they're interested in, and what people aren't interested in, they have a real hard time getting good at. But we all have strengths as well. And if we can find out what those strengths are and really hit the gas pedal on them, and it's kind of like Jim Collins' Good to Great book, there's a method to taking good and making it great that's proven, that's shown. And he wrote it, he's got a whole book about it. And strengths-based leadership is taking people that are good at things and they're making them great. And then you say, okay, you've got these things you're great at. How can we take each action that you do throughout a day or in your instruction and take your great qualities and really mesh those two things together so that everything you're feeding people is being done with your strength, either as a teacher or as a leader or a parent. It applies to everywhere in our lives.
Yeah, I like it. Versus beating somebody up every time they make a mistake. Focus on the strengths, right?
Yeah, because you're just not going to get very far. If you think about it, and we're sitting in a meeting, and I say to you, hey, Jay, these are the things I saw in your classroom that didn't work. What'd you just do? You just shut down. You're done with the meeting. You're thinking about how you don't really like me. You're thinking about, hey, man, I got to this other school, I'm tired of this place. Or you're thinking about reasons that it wasn't well, Johnny's not a very good kid. He doesn't understand math, and he answered the question and made me look bad. So your whole brain just went into this negative spin, and everything fell apart on the meeting. And we're done. We may talk 20 more minutes, but you're not talking anymore. You're done with me.
Yeah.
And it all started because I identified something you're not good at. And you know what? Most people understand what they're not good at. I'm not good at math. I make it a point of a joke. I like to walk into 4th and 5th grade classrooms and have math competitions with the kids on the board because they know they're going to beat me, and they get a kick out of it, but they see that I'm vulnerable and I'm human. And, as opposed to what if I sat down in the meeting and I said, hey, man, I was in your classroom today man, let me tell you these great things you did. Suddenly you're with me. Like you're listening and you're like, wow, maybe I didn't even realize I did that well. But we're having this great conversation. And usually what will happen is that people will then, kind of humble themselves as well, because, we all get we hear all the great things we're doing, and we have a natural tendency to interject, well, this part of the lesson just didn't go well. And when they present their weakness, or I do it with my superiors, then we can have a conversation where it's not an uncomfortable conversation, because it's just me acknowledging, hey, I don't really do math that well. Let's talk about it. And, how can I make that a strength? Well, I go in and I make myself humane by showing kids that, I can't do 8th grade math as well as some of our 8th graders. They get a kick out of it, and it bonds me to them. So I've taken a weakness and made it a strength. But if I sat down with a superior and they just looked at me and they go, we looked at your evaluation test that you did to come in here, and Mr. Bruni, you're terrible at math. I just shut down. So that there are really ways. It's all about those relationships and communicating and how you approach those things.
Wow, that's great. Well, so the last question I have: if you had a time machine and you could jump in it and go back to the point in time when you first made the decision to go into education, what advice would you go back and give to that younger version of yourself?
Man, this is like I said, I listen to your podcast. I get so much good stuff from here. It's for so many people that have way more experience than me, and they answer this question beautifully. And I was like, what would I do? Maybe I wouldn't have punted on that 4th and 3, and it would cost something inconsequential like that. And then I got to thinking about it, and I was like, a huge shift that I've found in myself that has changed everything for me is if I could go back and say, hey, Ben, let me give you some advice. You're going to catch more bees with honey. And early on in my career, I'm a big guy, 6'2", 230, football guy. I kind of got a gruff, bald head. And, I had always gotten a lot of things done early in my career by kind of being the intimidator. I was forceful. I have ability to, use my voice to, intimidate a classroom if I needed everybody to quiet down, or I could use my size to, kind of enter a room and establish, okay, I'm in charge in this room. And it got things done, but it also cost me a lot of relationships, to where even now there are people who have perceptions of me that are based on this guy from when I was 24, 25 years old that aren't correct anymore. They were then. And what I learned was that the best thing we can do when we need to, deal with people is to deal with them in a polite, kind manner, not raise our voice, not get into arguments, take deep breaths, go low and slow, and catch your bees with your honey. And it just, time and again, I have found that it has really worked in tough situations, whether it's a parent in my office or a really upset kid, or maybe even one of my superiors is mad at me about something, to not go meet their fire with my fire, to get the hose out and to water that fire down. The first thing we got to do is put the fire out, and then we can have a conversation. So, if I could go back and tell me to do something, I would say, hey, man, drop the bravado a little bit, relax, and just kind of meet people where they are and have a conversation with them, understand where they're coming from.
Boy, that's great advice. Great advice. It's not always easy to remember when you see something and you instantly kind of judge the reason that it happened, or, why somebody somebody else's intentions, right? And, and so you want to kind of go into attack mode. And I have found myself, of course, I have plenty of examples of both instances where I respond in a way that wasn't the best way. And then when I responded in the way that you're talking about, where you approach it and you really hear them out before you jump in and try to make accusations or anything else. And boy, it just goes so much better when you use honey instead of vinegar.
Oh, it does. I mean, and you got young kids, and I mean, how many times do we drop the ball? And I mean, you just spend the rest of the night feeling like the biggest heel on earth because, man, maybe you snapped at your kid, said something with a little bit too harsh a tone, and you see the effect it has on them. And it's just like, wow. And I try to remember that look on, one of my kids' faces when I've done something like that. When I get one of those emails, and we all get those emails, where it's just like your immediate response is, oh, yeah, I'm coming back. I'm coming out of my corner swinging on this one. And you type it up and you're banging keys. And then you look at it. And if you're wise, you take a deep breath. You acknowledge, man, I really wrote a great piece of writing there. And then you delete it.
Right.
And you just, you respond to those people and you say, instead of doing this over email, you think you come down to my office, or maybe I'll come down to you, I'll meet you at your place and we'll talk about this. And it's amazing how a little time and just a little compassion for that they're upset too really helps people to diffuse the situation.
Great stuff. Well, so finally, if one of our listeners wants to reach out to you after the show, what would be the best way to connect with you?
Well, I'm on Twitter, and they can find me at Bruni72, Bruni 72 on Twitter. Now, I do on social media. On Twitter, I try to be more of a person. I'm never a big fan of people that just use their Twitter account to retweet articles. Because not a lot of people are reading that. I try to, again, really get down to a level that, lets people know, hey, he's a human being. He's a guy, he's just like me. He's got a mortgage and 3 kids and one going off to college and a pool that needs to be cleaned. And, he's just like me. And so I try to use my social media like that. But probably the best way is on Twitter at Bruni72, or, they can email me, and it's ben.bruni at logan.kyschools, which is plural.us. So, those are probably the best ways to get a hold of me.
Awesome. EduLeaders, this has been a great interview today. For the show notes of today's show and other resources, visit educatorslead.com and type the word Ben into the search tool to find his show notes. Ben, thank you for sharing your journey with us today.
Oh, it's been wonderful, man. Thank you for this podcast. It made a difference for me, and I'm sure it's going to continue to make a difference for me. And I'm so, I'm honored to have gotten to sit down and talk to you, somebody who has really helped me through my own journey.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And that wraps up another episode of Educators Lead. This podcast is brought to you by Mometrics, the #1 test preparation company. Mometrics offers study materials for over 1,800 different exams, including the SAT, ACT, GED, end-of-course exams, state standard exams like the STAR, teacher certification exams, advanced placement, CLEP, ASVAB, GRE, and so many more. Mometrics takes the mountains of information students could be tested over for any given exam and boils it all down to just the fluff-free golden nuggets of information that are most likely to be on the exam. They couple that with some great study tips and test-taking strategies to help students maximize their test scores. With their interactive tutorial videos and a layout that makes lesson planning easy, Mometrics study guides, flashcards, and practice questions are a great fit for individual or classroom use. To learn more about our products and our vault of hundreds of free tutorial videos, please visit educatorslead.com/test prep. That's educatorslead.com/test prep. EduLeaders, thank you for joining us on Educators Lead. Visit us at educatorslead.com for everything we talked about today, free resources, and much, much more.